Hey everyone, this is Raymond, your co-host on the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch for live updates about future content. You can check us out on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. You can also become a founding member of our podcast by going to patreon.com/fpphilosophers, where you can support our show, get access to our blog, and learn more about the host of the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. My name is Thomas Jared Farmer, joined as always by my co-host Michael Granato.
Yeah, what up, Detroit?
And Raymond Perrier.
How's it going? What up, Detroit? Jeez.
Showing Detroit some love.
Oh Jesus! It's been a long hiatus, but we're here in the quarantine. Is this only our second quarantine episode, right?
Yeah, we haven't been super productive.
Oh well. Anyway, so today we're gonna talk about humanism, and then maybe we'll have time to record a second episode on transhumanism. So look forward to that. So what are all the cool kids saying about humanism, Raymond?
Nothing.
Yeah, nothing, right? No cool kid is talking about him. But so humanism is an idea. It's kind of this weird thing, and the academy, like the university and the academy. It's kind of like this line between being a theory and being sort of like a cultic following, of like people who call themselves humanist or whatnot. So it's kind of like a religion in its own right, and also like a philosophical theory is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. And mostly what humanism is a question of the nature of being human. What does it mean to be human? And it comes up in different points in history, but most notably in the more recent historical narrative of the Western world would be its rise in the modern period in like the 1600s, and all of the critiques, developments, and the naysayer anti-humanist up to modern day life in 2020. Debates over what it means to be human, debates over how that influences human action, typically discussions about ethics and morality. And in that way, I find humanism interesting because it's one of the areas of philosophical study where they actually connect philosophical theory with, moral theory, and how one could influence another, like how your understanding of a human being influences how you relate and engage with human beings on an ethical and moral level. So in that way, it's cool. But beyond that, there's no real strict definition of what can be involved in humanism because, the subject of understanding human nature is an all-encompassing subject, almost like physics.
Can I walk it back a little bit historically?
Yeah, go ahead.
And the only reason why I want to, I completely agree. I think that it's really with the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, that you see like the birth of, I think, what we understand as humanism. But like, in order to like really understand this, because it's an odd word, and you sometimes hear it, you hear people throw it around a lot without really explaining it. I was actually listening to, I can't remember their names, I'm not going to try to. I was listening to a discussion recently, and one of the guys said, well, how would you classify yourself? Like, how would you define yourself? Like, what school of thought do you belong to? Because we really like to like pigeonhole people into certain categories, like theist, atheist, agnostic, Democrat, Republican. So this person said humanist, and they're like, oh, okay. And they just kind of went on with the conversation. But I think the ancient world provides a good example of this. I think you see examples of it in ancient Greece, but also, I think you could apply the same thing to different Chinese schools of thought as well. especially with the debates and the discussions surrounding Confucianism, legalism, Taoism. But I'm more familiar with the Greek schools, so I'll stick with that as an example. But like when I think of humanism, I think of like ancient Greek schools of philosophy. And that has kind of lost its meaning nowadays because in the ancient world, these schools represented not just like a set of beliefs, but also in very real ways, like a way of life, like an approach to life. So, like when I think humanism, that's immediately what my mind's drawn to, like Stoicism, Epicureanism, something along those lines. I mean, would you agree with that? Would you push back on that?
I think that's a good encapsulation, generally speaking. What about you, Jared?
Yeah, I mean, the terminology, as far as I know, it comes from like humanitas, which is like the humane letters, which, as Mike pointed out, it really emerged from the Italian Renaissance. And then, of course, we associate humanism with things like the Northern Renaissance and people like Thomas More, Desiderius Erasmus. Um, and what that emphasis really was a departure in Renaissance thought, was kind of a return or rebirth. I mean, that's the entire meaning of Renaissance, was a rebirth, a return to ancient ways of thinking. So there was this call within the Renaissance for ad fontes, back to the sources. And so there was a rediscovery of a lot of the literature of antiquity during this period, and it reinvigorated a focus on the human subject. And so when we think about the humanities, it really emerges from this period where there was an emphasis on art and literature, architecture, and all of these different dimensions which were contributing factors to kind of human flourishing. And so, whereas this is a drastic oversimplification and really too strong of a periodization, but usually this is broken up historically in terms of the division between the emphases on the world beyond in much medieval thought and that sort of focus on formal logic and theology, and then within Renaissance and then through the Protestant Reformations, which were also to a large extent influenced by the humanities, you see this refocusing on the human subject. And so that really is the crucible through which modernity is birthed, right? So we typically attribute modernity to figures like Descartes, Leibniz, and the like. But really, I think that modernity was set in motion by these Renaissance figures who refocused an emphasis on the human subject by going back to earlier Greek and Greco-Roman sources, rereading people like Cicero, for example. So yeah, I think that forms some of the background for discussions on the humanities in general, about what it means to be a humanist. I think that at some point we have to make this distinction between humanism and also something that I'm sure you've probably heard in evangelical Christian discourse, which is the contrast between Christianity as they conceive it and so-called secular humanism. So we need to make a formal distinction between what humanism is, and I think at some point between what they mean when they use a qualifier like secular humanism.
I would also like to explore like what comes along with accepting the category of humanism. Like what's at stake? What are you kind of implying about your belief system, that sort of thing? But humanism and secularism is interesting as well.
I think in today's terms, because we're coming strongly out of the modern and Enlightenment period, that the most commonly associated concepts to the idea of humanism would probably be something along the lines of freedom, individualism, of course, critical reflection, critical thinking, a strong belief in science for the most part, I think most humanists would agree, but there are forms of religious humanism as well that crop up. And but in terms of those concepts, I think those are central. And I think that in many ways, when you get really into studies in humanism, when people start debating it, it really comes back down to that distinction between the dichotomy or sort of dialectic between the way you live your life and the way that you conceive of your existence, and how those interact and mutually sort of like condition each other. So we can talk about that in two ways, because I think that the sort of political, ethical agenda of trying to think about humanity as being the commonality between humanity, right? Because that's what they're seeking in humanism, is trying to find that sort of commonality between us, and then saying that common feature is that we can all be free individualist, like self.
I think to some extent, humanism conceives of humanity as a project,
Yeah, exactly. As a
developmental process that we all are engaged in at two levels. One, as individuals, our task is the product of our own lives. So my goal in living on this planet is to fully develop myself as much as possible in terms of fulfilling my humanity. And in so doing, I'm furthering the process of humanity writ large, right? So it's kind of a two-tier thing, that in fulfilling my own kind of maximal sense of my own humanity, I'm flourishing with respect to the progress of the human project. Is another characteristically modern feature of humanism is this idea of kind of a linear progression. And we talked about this last time with regards to philosophy of time. But modernity really is focused on this kind of uphill project, that we have this teleological trajectory towards our own fulfillment. And so part of conceiving oneself as a human, and part of the project of humanity is kind of like, what is it that your end goal is? Like, what do you think the goal of humanity is? And that largely dictates what your values are and how you go about living your life, because you have some end in mind.
So let me raise a quick question here, because you both brought up the connection between humanism and morality and humanism and politics, which I'm interested to explore. So, like, what would you say? Like, is there a humanist morality, or does humanism imply some sort of moral system or moral theory? And then from there, we could talk about its connection with politics, its connection with this idea of freedom, maybe political freedom.
I mean, I think obviously the most obvious thing would be humanism's, especially the way that we conceive of it today, humanism's connection to utilitarianism, which is an ethical philosophy for those of us who have never heard of that silly word, that basically says there's utility in life, and that the greatest utility in life is pleasure or happiness, depending on how you want to conceive of that. And then anything that doesn't give you that should be conceived as, non-utilitarian or non sort of useful, in the sense that it doesn't bring pleasure to the greatest number of people. And so I think that humanism on the whole abides by that, probably most sort of like generally and broadly. But I do think that there is a way to talk about like virtue ethics, right? Going back to the Greeks and talking about, virtues like prudence, patience, courage, things like that, that an individual develops, for themselves. That's not some sort of innate characteristic that, allows you to sort of delineate between people as being better or worse in this, but just simply as a way of being able to develop as a human on your own right. But that all brings up, of course, the universality presumption of humanism, which we can talk about as one of its biggest, critical weaknesses for some people.
Well, I think that it certainly implies some sense of morality, insofar as we can conceive of morality as um, some set of prescriptive behaviors, right? So if you conceive of humanity in a particular way, then that kind of necessarily follows that you're going to think of some way of achieving the goals of humanity, and that's going to imply some sort of behavior. So I think humanism, however defined or constituted, is going to include some ethical dimension, but I don't know that it necessarily has to share the same ethical set of precepts. In other words, that every humanist is going to abide by the same set of values, but instead that all of them are going to conceive of philosophy generally, and then just life um, really as a project of self-fulfillment. That's in keeping with philosophy and antiquity, which is, again, as you said, very much a lifestyle choice and not just theory. I mean, in the modern era, to a certain extent, this is this weird bifurcation, right? So there's some respects in which modernity is borrowing from antiquity and departure from medieval conceptions. But one of the things which has been preserved in modernity is really the theorization of philosophy, such that philosophy becomes really detached from life. And this is part of the constant criticism of contemporary philosophy, is that it's ivory tower, people, sitting around in their armchairs discussing matters. Whereas if you go back and look at antiquity, philosophy is really about like discovering the most productive ways of living.
So, kind of dwelling on this moral issue real quick. So, would you say that, like, so, okay, maybe there's a possibility of different ethical theories that a humanist could adopt. Maybe they're not limited to utilitarianism, as Raymond said, or virtue ethics. But do you think that this emphasis on humanism implies maybe a commitment to something along the lines of like the golden rule, or maybe like the no harm principle? Like, do you think that there's like a standard sort of theory of ethics that humanists as a whole would sort of agree to?
To some extent, there are things like that. I think, the sort of one-off, sort of like absolute universal ethical concepts that I think that many would say are reflected in the more basic principles that they adhere to in humanism, which is, uh, you know, respect for the human being as a free individual, capable in their own right of being responsible, making decisions, things like that. And as a result of that, I think there are certain inevitable moral tenets that you have to abide by, like maybe not something um, more specific, but something more broadly, like all humans, regardless of race and gender, then would be capable, treated equally as responsible, free individuals that should be able to do anything everybody else can do, you know, assuming certain things, right? So in that way, they would be people who would advocate for egalitarian political, ethical, and economic decisions on some level, if they thought that that was in keeping with those principles. So I think that there are some things, and that would be kind of like a golden rule. Do that which would secure the freedom for the most people, or for every human individual, something like that.
Yeah, I think there's some implicit metaphysics with respect to this, right? So what's taken for granted is that humanity is a thing. Um, however you want to define it, there's some presumption that there's some shared sense of human dignity, and that thereby affords individual human beings respect, so that egalitarianism becomes kind of a foundational principle. And what you see in departures from this are attempts at dehumanization, right? So if you don't accept that basic principle that all human beings are equally deserving of respect because they share some property which we define or call humanity, then you can start to make gradations in terms of what is and what is not human, right? So things approach humanity or they move away from them. And the degree to which we want to acknowledge someone or some thing's humanity is the degree to which we are forced to treat them with respect. So, for example, if you want to take away someone's civil liberties, then rhetorically, the first thing that people start to do is they start to refer to them in dehumanizing ways, right? These aren't people, they're vermin. And only through that sort of callous move to remove someone's humanity can you thereby go about, delegitimizing their claims to rights.
Yeah, it's really it's a way of copying out of any real sense of responsibility. Oh, this is a criminal. They aren't deserving of this. And then they can kind of, in good conscience, move forward according to their thinking. But I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, they're not a person; they're an animal. Right?
Yeah, the spectrum is important. I think there that you kind of mentioned, and we should talk about that because the reason I wanted to discuss this topic is because humanism seems to be reintroducing itself in the last 10 to 15 years in a way that would suggest that it can be an answer to a lot of the sort of postmodern, even like progressive political ideologies. It's like a philosophical companion. But there are, of course, reasons why people don't like humanism. There are critiques of humanism, which has required the tradition to sort of reimagine itself because inevitably, as I think Michael was hinting to in some sense, when you try and define what it means to be human, that can often be selective, exceptional, and exclusive, right? And that is why many, many, many people, including people in the feminist tradition, including people in the Black liberation theology tradition, who would be, wary of humanism because humanism has been a discussion about what it means to be human, largely from the white male perspective, which means that it has a tendency to limit or exclude people who are not getting those advantages and privileges, right?
So I brought this up. I was thinking about that. I'm not familiar with humanism all that much, or the objections to humanism. But with respect, with modernity within the historical context, these ideas are being developed. We also have to remember that this is being developed within the context of colonialism, imperialism, slavery, modern slavery, the American slave trade. So I don't think, as with anything, I don't think you can completely separate like pure philosophical thought from what's concretely happening in the world. So I was just, I was curious about that. And I'm curious to explore that problem.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good discussion to have. I think it's fitting for now, this context, right? Because I think that humanism encapsulates a lot of the ways that people think about their existence in the world, especially people who are deeply in tuned with, um, purpose in life, trying to derive purpose and meaning, and explore and really respect these ideas like freedom for everybody or freedom for the human, right? Everybody deserves freedom and individual, respect and equality and things like that. But it comes up in weird ways that those things don't get played out on an institutional level. And so
well,
go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, because we're trying to keep this episode short, so I just wanted to summarize some of the critique I think of humanism is in the attempt to create some sort of universal essence, right, by which we can judge humanity. One of the foundations that the Western tradition has built that upon is the idea of rationality, and then traditionally, rationality has been exclusive in its treatment of women and people of color. And so what is supposed to be a foundational essence by which we can accept the universal conception of humanity becomes a means of excluding certain individuals or subordinating certain individuals. I was reading an old article from the Atlantic today. It's published back in 2017. Mike, you may be familiar with it. It's called something to the effect of "The Myth of the Kindly Robert E. Lee," something along those lines. And it was really pushing back against the lost cause narrative's valorization of Robert E. Lee as some sort of paragon of virtue. And it was pointing out some of the pretty terrible things that he said. But one of the things that was consistent with respect to this and a lot of slaveholders' justifications for what they were doing was the idea that slavery was a what's the word I'm looking for? Was a enculturating.
Yeah.
It was a civilizing institution.
You're doing the slaves a favor by enslaving them.
Um, Lee actually made the case that slavery was worse for white people, and that black people were better off under slavery than they were in Africa because they didn't have the tutelage of the civilized, rational white man. And so part of the critique, again, of modernity, and it's not that modernity had to be shaped in this way, or that modernity naturally leads to this, but you can take that rhetoric of rationalization and you can conform it to corrupt ends. So part of the critique again of modernity's appeals to rationality as the basis for humanity is it excludes a lot of people, and it's not to say that people of color or women are actually less rational. That just is the rhetoric that people have made. But you do have to consider things like people with diminished capacities. Are they somehow less human because they can't, perform certain kind of cognitive functions in the way that people on an average basis can? So the problem with this sort of rhetoric is if you begin with a place of accepting the basic dignity of all humans, I think that's fine, but you have to kind of accept that, to my mind, as just a given metaphysical thing. If you start to examine it too closely or start to create criterion by which you can judge someone's humanity, then it starts to go off the rails pretty quickly. It becomes kind of one of this. What's Kant's phrase? Becomes a shit.
Oh yeah. Just like a practical principle, or pragmatic.
Yeah, but he says it in a specific way. It's like a practical postulate.
Oh, practical postulate. Yeah, practical postulate.
Okay, so all right, so here's where you can jump back in. And to use Kantian terminology, is a practical postulate of human reason, right? We can't really establish it beyond the fact we just have to accept it, because to not accept it, becomes problematic.
And I think there's the humanist seems to start in a sort of at a point of one direction, and that is they want to begin with a theory of humanity, what it means to be human, and then they want to work their way towards an idea of ethics and behavior and morality based on that theory. And in many ways, you almost need them to like switch it around and say, no, 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 humans are dignified beings that demand respect and that we should stand in solidarity and then start with that and then move to, and this is what it means to be human because of that. And I think that there's some hesitancy to do that on some level because it seems presumptive, right? It seems like we're presuming some idea of what it means to be human to say that it's dignified, and that's the struggle. And that's why some would say humanism is just maybe not worth salvaging. Some people would say that we just need to move beyond it and forget it.
Well, let me offer one other point of critique. A point of critique could be someone like Peter Singer's conception about animal liberation. So, what's important for Singer is not whether or not something is rational, but whether or not it has the capacity to feel pain, right? So all sentient beings deserve respect and not equal treatment, because that would be silly, right? You don't treat a dog the same way that you treat a human being, but you have equal consideration for the propensity of creating pain, right? So that you have to consider the well-being of anything which can experience pain, because the basis of dignity lies there, not with something's ability to think, but with something's ability to experience suffering. And I think there's something to that. And if that's the case, if Singer is right, then yeah, I mean, it kind of compels you to rethink the basis of humanism, if not to scrap it, at least to open up the possibility of expanding it to also include other sentient beings. Not to recognize them as human, but to recognize them as equally worthy of dignity and respect, the sort of things that you are ideally supposed to afford to other humans, such that we have to treat them in a moral way. Not expecting them to reciprocate, but of course,
Yeah, that really highlights the central difficulty, because what does it mean to say that something is humane, right? I mean, somebody from the ethical treatment of people for the ethical treatment of animals, PETA, would be saying something very different than somebody who is working in a organic farm that harvests beef year round. Um, would say something different, right? I mean, PETA people would say that killing any animal because it brings pain is wrong. And then somebody on an organic farm who gives their cows green pastures and all the food they could eat in happiness might say, well, I don't see anything wrong with eating that animal as long as I give it a happy life prior to that moment, right? So it gets sticky there.
well, there's also at a certain point, there's also a failure to recognize that even happy lives are filled with pain and suffering. That happiness isn't necessarily the absence of pain and suffering, because part of life is pain and suffering.
So the other question I wanted to ask, so we talked about the connection between humanism and morality. Um, Related to that, I also want to talk about the connection between humanism and politics and political philosophy. Specifically speaking, do you think that humanism, with its emphasis on freedom, with its emphasis on human liberty, do you think that humanism is more geared towards certain types of government or certain government structures, or i.e., like Western democracy, or do you think it's more open to interpretation?
I think the most general answer would be that it has to be open. I'm hopeful and certain that humans will at some point uh, you know decide that even democracy, capitalism, socialism, whatever it is not sufficient enough, and we'll come up with some more efficient and better way of essentially designing and organizing human beings. But a lot of that boils down to how do you define freedom? Oftentimes freedom is defined by what you want to be free of or free from.
That's like a negative sense of freedom, as opposed to a positive sense of freedom, like what you're free from as opposed to what you're free to do. And so I think that the idea of a negative freedom as freedom to not be constrained by others is kind of it's a very anemic sense of freedom, but it's one that a lot of people have.
And somebody in certain circumstances who has a nice, well secured economic, politically, established life might say that they want freedom from one thing, while somebody who's struggling against, the current political system, the current economic system, might say they want, freedom from something else, or freedom to do something else, or, whatever that might be. I told Michael earlier that it would be like Jeff Bezos saying he wants freedom from a big government because they want to come after capital corporations for their money and things like that to help others or use them for things, and a middle American or minimum wage worker in America might say, no, I need you know government to intercede and help because the system's functioning against me. And so that's a very different sense of freedom for both sides, and that's what's typically problematic about humanist thinking on politics and things like that.
Well, I would say that no one should give a shit what billionaires think, and also that typically what billionaires mean when they say that they want freedom is they want the freedom to continue to exploit working people. So it's basically like saying that the slave master wants his continued freedom to exploit the labor of black bodies. Like, why should anyone give a shit about that sense of freedom? Your freedom is not for the exploitation of others. It's antithetical to the very concept of humanism. So I think capitalism is starkly opposed to any sense of egalitarianism, which would be birthed from, I think, a fair reading of what humanism is intended to be, which is some conception of shared humanity, some sense of like the dignity of being, of having an embodied existence. And I think that capitalism and political systems which prop it up are inherently, opposed to that. They don't treat human beings as human beings. They treat human beings as cogs in a machine. They treat human beings as units of capital and labor. You're reduced to a number. You're reduced to a production unit. And so, in that regard, I think capitalism can't be reconciled with a real sense of what humanism is supposed to be about.
But what about concepts such as, or forms of government, like talking strictly larger, like political philosophy? Like, do you think that, for example, the notion of humanism with its emphasis on human freedom and the dignity of human beings implies like what we see with like Western democracy? Or could this come into play like with maybe different forms of socialism? Maybe, I mean, take it to the extreme extent, would it be compatible for one to be a humanist and also be like a fascist, for example?
I don't think so, personally, because I think that fascism necessarily assumes a hierarchy between, the powerful and those who are meant to be suppressed. I mean, fascism is a hierarchical system, necessarily. It's kind of a worship of power. And so power is a meaningless term unless it's power over something. And to my mind, egalitarianism and humanism are supposed to go hand in hand. When we talk about Western liberal democracies, the rhetoric is egalitarian. How those governments actually function is a lot of times not in keeping with the democratic principles that they espouse. So I think that the rhetoric of a lot of Western democracies, so-called, is correct because they espouse egalitarian principles, democratic rule. Whether or not they actually adhere to that is, I think, open for interpretation. I'd say that they don't. I mean, they haven't been democratic for the entirety of their existence. But the question is whether or not those systems allow for the possibility of democracy, democratic rule, and egalitarian ideals, or whether or not they're opposed to it. And I think that fascism and kind of top-down authoritarianism is just incompatible. So in Western democracies, we have kind of the correct rhetoric and a failure to adhere to it. And then with respect to like right-wing demagoguery, we have a system which is just irreconcilable with principles of humanism and egalitarianism.
Yeah. And I think that's a fairly recent and like newer interpretation of humanism as being it's outspokenly and fundamentally egalitarianism. I think that there's an implication in a lot of the ways that humanists think, but I don't think that it was always the central point. And more recently, scholars have been saying no, like humanism cannot be anything other than egalitarianism because it's sort of the natural extension of the universality that's being theoretically proposed and postulated about what it means to be human, which has always been, one of the big critical points of humanist theories is that the human being cannot be reducible down to any one thing or something, right? That could be universally applicable across the entire scope of humanity. So egalitarianism says if universality is true, then it has to be equal.
So, Raymond, getting back to this, getting back to these critiques that we sort of come up with last time, what would a humanism that takes, what would somebody that's a humanist that says, okay, I get that, I understand that maybe we can't start drawing distinction between one human or another, or maybe one human being better than another, or whatever, and accepts the historical roots of humanism being rooted in colonialism, and saying, okay, we got that, let's move forward. And maybe even on the political spectrum saying, okay, let's accept that egalitarianism is fundamental to humanism. How would they move forward there?
I think that it looks like more progressive forms of political and economic systems, that would say things like, billionaires are, like a policy era, like they're an error in politics and, morality. Like, they shouldn't exist because it creates a disequilibrium between human beings that is detrimental to their dignity, and it does so necessarily. So it would evaluate things in those terms first. And I think that that's important because there's a sense in which utilitarianism has been writ large into the ethical perspective of all sciences, which still in many ways dominate the political, economic, social sphere in terms of dictating policy and things that really matter. In that sense, there's this dehumanizing effect of treating humans as utility, whether it's in the best intentions or not, and thinking in terms of the dignity of an individual, the question of equality because of that dignity, right? Starting there really changes the scope and the trajectory of a political or economic sphere, because it would suggest that people like Bezos shouldn't have $120 billion when there are people who are working their asses off and they can't even afford to buy a house. There's just the indignity of what we would see as being basic, like, for example, American ideals, the individualism, the freedom, the self-sustaining independence that we expect if we want to opt out of certain things. And there are people that can't afford some of the basic, necessities of life, while people have more money than they could possibly spend in a single lifetime. That's not basing any sort of. There's no way that any of that could be based on any sort of egalitarianism. It's simply based on sort of hyper individualism, hyper like modern Hobbesian, only interested in your like self-interestedness, so to speak, which we associate with things like capitalism.
Well, I would say that billionaires aren't a glitch in the system of capitalism. They're what the system defaults to, right? So it's a system of exploitation that moves, wealth upwards. But I would say that one of the distinctions that needs to be made in terms of recognizing a particular metaphysics which has moral implications is recognizing human beings have inherent and not merely instrumental value. And I think that any political system which reduces human beings to their instrumentality is necessarily dehumanizing. So another discourse that we could get into is the idea of disability, for example. Like, the very idea of disability presumes kind of a reduction to utility, to say that certain people within society can't function in society at an optimal level, therefore they are disabled rather than differently abled people, that they're not simply embodied in a different way, but they're somehow lesser, and because they can't contribute to society in the way that we want them to, because society has not been built for them, that they're somehow less human, and that they're an obstacle or a burden on the rest of us. I think that systems which reduce people and their humanity in that way will invariably create these categories where some people are just less human than others, because we conceive of them as contributing less to society. So that, those people are burdens on society, not just other members of society. That they're somehow a burden to us because we have to take care of them.
And that's so relevant to like everything happening right now, like the pandemic, dividing people on whether or not this whole nonsense about the cure being worse than the disease type stuff because the economy is shutting down. It's like, well, people should just be willing to sacrifice themselves to get back to work and, saving this economy. Or the idea that you should feel shameful because you had to go on unemployment, or shameful because you couldn't pay a house note or something like that because you lost your job, and you should feel shameful that you're scared to go back to your job even if somebody decides to offer you a new job. It's all that reduction to your ability to contribute to society economically, productive in the sense that work is about making money and producing things. So that's why I thought we should talk about it.
I think that's probably a good place to stop.
All right, guys. I think we're going to have to wrap it up. So, any final thoughts?
Nope. Stay tuned for transhumanism. We'll talk about that and whether or not it
Yeah,
escapes
we're gonna
these issues.
we're gonna transcend the human.
And a discussion about the new show Upload too.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for this discussion. We will catch you next time when we talk a little bit about moving beyond humanism and what that looks like, for better or worse. So, thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Deuces.
Stay safe. Bye. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Front Porch Philosophers. If you did, go follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch. If you liked it so much that you want to support us monetarily, then go to patreon.com/FPPhilosophers and become a $1 subscriber today. Every dollar goes to adding more content and buying up more server space, so the more you spend, the more you get. In any case, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Front Porch.